Hi there. In this video, we will continue the discussion about the international law. If you remember in the previous video, we talked about the definition of the international law. We talked about the reasons for international law and the sources of international law, which goes back to the Roman empires. Then we talk about the doctrine of comity, which is the interference of one court in the decision of another court. In this video, we will talk about the different institutions. We call it transnational institutions. And we will talk about some terminologies, and we will end up this video with a brief presentation about the Foreign Corrupt Practice Act. The first one is the international trade institutions, which we can put them into one group. We call it transnational institutions. And as you know, the nations are sovereign in their control of their own enterprises. But there are some institutions came out recently try to regulate the trade. And one of them is IATA, which was trying to regulate the airline and the air transport. And here is their website, which shows you, like how they do the regulation in the airline area. I encourage you to take a look on their policies here, which reflects the control of IATA over the airlines that are trying to become a member on them. And the other thing, it's the world trade, and the world trade began back in 1947 by the GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs and Trade. And we have seen the GATT in the previous video. The GATT came with one goal, is not to make any discrimination in trade and process resolving the international trade dispute. So the GATT came out trying to standardize the trade across the countries. As you can see here, the GATT started or supported by different countries, and it was expanded later. But the World Trade Organization came out in 1995, which you could say like around 45 or 50 years, because of the change in time happened, and the GATT was not really sufficient after 50 years. So the World Trade Organization came out trying to fill the gap in this change. And the WTO was responsible for all the international trade agreements, and one of them is the Agreement on Service, the other one, Agreement on Intellectual Properties, and the last one, Agreement on Investment Measure. And the GATS here, it's the General Agreement on Trade in Services. And you can see here the full document. As you can see here, you can see the PDF format or the Word format, that can explain in detail what is this agreement talking about. As you can see, it's 35 pages. I encourage you to take a look on this one, which stipulate the rules and regulation of WTO on the area of service. The second one is TRIPS, which is Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property. And here it talks about the control of intellectual property across the countries, how the intellectual property can be protected. And you can see here, there is some links explaining the TRIPS and a guide onto this agreement. The next one is TRIMS, which is Trade-Related Investment Measures. And this is also has been made by the WTO. And here on their website, you can see that it's explaining the objectives of TRIMS, the limitation of TRIMS, and so on. So I encourage you, I'm not going to ask you in the exam to remember all the information in these websites, but it's good to take a look and see what are the agreements that came out starting from GATT to GATT's, TRIPS, and TRIMS. I'm sorry for all these acronyms. The next slide here, the IMF, and the next slide talking about World Bank. Both of them, they came out in 1944. And their main goal is to provide funding to the developing countries that can protect their economy and maintain a reasonable standard of life for the population on those countries. The IMF, as I said, didn't care much about the politics, so much about the economy. But the IMF was facing big criticism back in the 90s when the Soviet Union was dissolved. And the IMF could not respond to the challenges that came out as a dissolution of the Soviet Union. The other thing, the IMF was giving funding or lending to the developing countries without any kind of in control. The same thing, the World Bank did the same thing, was trying to give funds to the developing countries without any control, and this was also a huge criticism for the World Bank. The World Bank was initially started as the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and then the name was changed and was trying to make some relief for the countries that came out from the Second World War, and then trying to give funds to stabilize their economy. But as I said, like the corrupted regime in the developing countries used to take the fund for themselves without making any change in the economy of the developing country. And the other thing, there was no improvement in the economies. And because of that, the IMF and the World Bank tried to slow down. On the regional basis here in the US, there was an agreement happened in 2018 between US, Canada, and Mexico. And this was like an extension or replacement to NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And it was focused also on the trade rather than the politics among the countries. The MCUSA was focusing on the elimination of discrimination among the members of the agreement. So the three countries are encouraged to trade their products and there is no discrimination among them. They also encourage to go into the market of any individual members of the countries here. And there is no taxes almost in the trade among the three countries. So some tariffs, import and export, were eliminated, and trying to encourage the trade among those three countries. The next one is the European Union, which came out in 1994 with 12 countries, and then now it became 27 countries, trying to make up something similar to what we see under MCUSA, but here across Europe, making Euroland with one currency, euro. However, back in 2020, the UK was the first country to leave the European Union. Meanwhile, there's a few countries now trying to join the European Union, and the main currency of the European Union is euro. And we are aware from the news of what's going on in the European Union. So the European Union was like a regional institution that came out trying to stabilize the economy of the European countries. Now let us jump to the different definitions that we might see in the international law. First of all is sanctions or embargoes, which happened usually by the government when the government or the country trying to prohibit the trade of another country. It's called sanction or embargo. Excuse me. This is accepted, and it's been written in the UN Charter, and it's even, like approved for like regional organization to do that, like European Union, they can make sanctions. The Organization for African Unity and the Organization of American States, so all these regional organizations, they can make sanctions. But if the sanctions come by individuals, we call it boycotts. So the boycotts, it's sanctions by individuals. It can be supported by the government or it might not be supported. But we need to differentiate between these two different terms. The next point is the taxes. Some government, they might not make sanctions, but they might impose taxes on the imports to protect the local industry. And when we set taxes on the imports, it's called tariffs. Taxes on the export usually falls under export license, where the government charge the exporters high fees to get the license for exporting. If we add the tariff and the exporting license, we come up with quota systems. The quota systems, it's actually a mix between tariffs and export to control the local economy against any fluctuation or any disturbance by too much importing, rather too much exporting, and vice versa. The next point that we can see it in the government with international business, sometimes the hosting government makes a deal with the international business that come to the country. For example, the hosting government might buy the whole company from the international company and paying them a fair price. We call it expropriation. So expropriation, the host government is purchasing the international business that come to the country for a fair price. But if the hosting government takes control of the international business without any payment or compensation, we call it confiscation. And if the government try to take some ownership in the international business for the sake of decision control or profit sharing, we call it domestication. So please remember those three items. The last point before we go to the exercise is the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And this act came out in the 1974, where the US government was trying to put restrictions on the American companies that goes overseas to make their business. So the US companies at that time was really healthy and were trying to expand their business outside the local jurisdiction. So they tried to pay some kind of bribes to the international official governments to give them permission to operate in the other countries. The US government was not happy about this kind of payment because it's considered as bribe and it's a crime. And because of that, they put restrictions on the board of directors to control these kind of payments. And they require the board of directors to make internal control to monitor the expenses that might be paid by the executive management when they expand their business in some countries like this. And until now, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, it's a big topic, but this is what you need to be aware of in this chapter. If you need anything, please let me know. I encourage you now to do the second exercise, and hopefully you do well and enjoy your study for this chapter. Thank you. Bye-bye.